In our Faith Church family, we recently studied the life of Jesus through the Gospel of John, and it took 40 sermons. Verse by verse, we worked the whole way through, start to finish, and I was concerned that it was getting long, repetitive, maybe even boring, predictable. And I thought to myself, 40 sermons on the life of Jesus, is this over the top? Maybe, but maybe not. I say that because in our next chapter of the book, Surprise the World, the 5 Habits of Highly Missional People, written by Michael Frost, chapter 6 is called Learn, the 4th habit. And Frost points out the phrase that early Christians stated called to learn Christ. Very common to them, but I have to admit, this was new to me. So I searched for verses in the New Testament that might actually have that phrase in there, and I didn't find any. I mean, I know the Apostle Paul says, I want to know Christ. Also, Jesus wrote in Matthew 11:29, take my yoke upon you and learn from me. He also said in John 6:45 that everyone who listens to the Father and learns from him comes to me. But those are not quite the same. So what does learn Christ mean? Well, Frost says that for the early Christians, it meant denying the pagan gods and entering into a period of catechism, committing oneself to an intensive study of the person and work of Jesus. How about you? Can you say that you have committed yourself to an intensive study of Jesus? Now, Frost writes this. He says, we need to know Jesus if we're going to share him as the reason for the hope we have. Jesus led the most questionable life of all. Do you remember that phrase from way back in chapter 1? A questionable life? Frost said that a questionable life should be the goal of all Christians. We shouldn't be living in such a way that people ignore us or think that we're hypocrites or think that we don't matter. Instead, we should be living in such a way that people can't help but question us as to why are we living the way we're living? How are we doing this? Well, when we practice the 5 bells habits of highly missional people, we will be living like Jesus lived. And people will want to question us. And then we'll have the opportunity to introduce them to him. Frost brings up something that my guess is many of you have heard of before. It's an acronym, WWJD. What does it stand for? Do you know? It's what would Jesus do? In the 1990s, youth group kids were wearing bracelets that had WWJD. It was all over the place. And it's good. We should want to do what Jesus would do. But there's a sneaky presupposition underneath that question. It's the presupposition that we actually already know what Jesus would do in any given situation, and that we could actually do it. But there's 2 major presuppositions there. Number 1, do we know what he would do? And number 2, could we even do it? I would submit to you that there's many situations in which we don't know what Jesus would do, and many that we probably couldn't do what he did. So rather than WWJD, we should hear a different question. We should wear a different bracelet. And it's an acronym that I think would go the whole way around the bracelet. It's HDYKWJWDIYDKWJWD. Yeah, what do you think that stands for? Well, here's the deciphering of it. How do you know what Jesus would do if you don't know what Jesus would do? Point is, if we don't know what Jesus would do in a given situation, we need to learn. We need to learn Jesus. And that's the fourth habit, learn. In particular, we're learning to live like Jesus lived. As Frost writes, this is a practice of learning that is called incarnational living. Incarnation is a word that means in the flesh. Jesus is God in the flesh. By his life, he shows us what God is like when God takes on human flesh. Now, no doubt about it, the incarnation, the enfleshment of God in Jesus is entirely unique. He was 100% God and 100% man. You and I will never become 100% God and 100% man. But we can still incarnate God to a lesser degree. To the world around us, we can learn to live more and more like Jesus lived. And when we increasingly resemble or incarnate him, people will see that in us. Again, remember that the prerequisite to actually living like Jesus lived is first learning about him. And the best way to do that is to read the 4 biographies of Jesus in the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Study him in them, intentionally, curiously, consistently, and prayerfully, asking God, Lord, make me more like Jesus. Now, as Frost writes, to make this a habit, spend at least one significant period of time studying the Gospels each week. And then I would encourage you to add on top of that, maybe reading what some others have written about Jesus. I love Philip Yancey's book, The Jesus I Never Knew. Or Patrick Henry Reardon's book, The Jesus We Missed. And then watch dramatic presentations like The Chosen that are so wonderful to give us an idea of what Jesus might have been like. In his book, The Spirit of the Disciplines, Dallas Willard writes that Jesus was the most intelligent man who ever lived. And thus we would do well to learn about him, learn from him, and follow his example. So, we add to the habits. We've been learning this list. Bells. B stands for bless. Who are the 3 people that you're going to bless this week? And at least one of them, who will that be outside the church family? And then eat. Who are the 3 people that you're going to eat with? And at least one of them not part of the church family. Then L, listen. We talked about this last week. When will you spend that one period of time this week intently listening to the voice of the Spirit? And then finally, like we learned today, what is that one period of time where you will spend learning about Jesus?